I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the podcast. This week I'm chatting with John Little, who started the Grass Roof Company back in 1998. And what they do is that they introduce wild landscapes into public spaces, and they create places that are just as good for wildlife as they are for the humans that use them. And they create spaces where the two can interact. He really seems to be pushing the boundaries. It's amazing what he's doing in terms of creating biodiversity, but also creating public spaces that are lower management and where people can actually engage with the landscape, which I think is he's been doing, as he says, kind of for 20 years, what we're just kind of waking up to now as an industry and as people. So he really has been pioneering this style of landscaping for a while. And he's also a green roof expert. So do go and check out his website, which he gives the details of at the end, because he's got so much good information on there and so many different projects that he's been involved with. It's a brilliant resource. So I hope you enjoy the interview. I just wanted to start by perhaps if you could just tell me a little bit about what you do at the Grass Roof Company.
I suppose the stuff that I've always been interested in for years has now become fashionable. So the stuff that 20 years ago when we started was difficult to sell and difficult for people to get excited about is now a lot easier for me. So that's a good thing. And I suppose essentially all it's really just about see if we can squeeze in plant soils and habitat into urban places, which then it directly make people's lives better. You get the habitat and wildlife in on the back of that. In particular, which is quite cool, is what I think is really interesting area is to get habitat into infrastructure that you have to have. So that might be a cycle shelter or a bin shelter or a crash barrier or a bridge or the hard stuff that we have to make cities function. If we can integrate habitat into those, it's a win-win. And it's not a great big chunk of budget either to move that to that side. So that's quite exciting. The other exciting thing for me is the potential of creating new habitats. There's always been emphasis with the wildlife conservation crew of preserving bits of ancient meadow, bits of ancient woodland, reserves, and they become like little enclosures of habitat. And I think the potential to create new habitats from scratch on the back of maybe a factory disappearing or a new development going in, or when we get a chance to create a habitat from scratch, then that's a really exciting thing to do. And it's really underplayed. The potential of that is really underplayed. So somewhere like the Bards Wetland Centre and maybe somewhere like the Canby-Wick Brownfield sites, I mean, there's loads and loads of them, but where we've adapted what seemingly was a desolate place and a habitat-free and a wildlife-free place into somewhere that's now become hugely important. In fact, often more important than the SSSI sites that are all around. That's kind of exciting, and I think that's potential. And highway embankments, another classic place, road wide. Anytime we put a road through, the potential to create good habitats alongside roads, alongside railways is huge as well. Not to say that it's been done brilliantly up to now, but there's potential, if we think about it, to get it done really good. And I think that's a cool thing. And then also work off the back of entomologists. So bugs, not the most sexy thing, but bugs, if you get the habitat right for bugs, then pretty much everything follows. So I think landscape should be dictated much more by entomologists than it should be necessarily by fashionable landscape architects, maybe. You know what I mean? We should work from that backwards.
Yeah.
So I suppose everything we do is based around that in some way, I guess, the Grass Roof Company.
So what's the difference between, if, say, some work's been done, such as road widening, what is the difference between what you do and just leaving it to go back to nature?
Well, you can leave it to go back to nature. It depends what you leave to go back to nature from, doesn't it? So a lot of the embankments tend to be reprofiled, and then often there's a kind of culture of re-topsoiling. So there's this kind of slight obsession, and this happens in all public spaces, using topsoil always because we're a nation of gardeners and it's too counterintuitive to think we should use other substrates apart from topsoil. As soon as you put topsoil down, then you immediately restrict your species mix. So the diversity of the plant mix is always going to reduce generally if you have rich, fertile topsoil, or any topsoil, in fact. If you can reprofile an embankment, and there's one going on right near me at the moment on the A13, beautiful, sandy, ballasty embankment that's been reprofiled, would be a wonderful habitat if it was just left. I don't know entirely what's going to happen, but I'm guessing that there'll probably be topsoil and shrubs and trees planted on it. So although that feels good from a public point of view and maybe an immediate aesthetic, people are planting trees and that's a good thing. We need to have more of a diverse mix of habitats on embankments. So we need to leave some plain sand embankments, brilliant places for all sorts of invertebrates, fantastic places for diversity of wildflowers, and many, many other things. I'm not saying there's not a place for tree planting. Obviously there is, but we need to have a mixture, a diversity of habitats. That's what we need, a kind of different kind of mosaic of habitats. Because as soon as you create that, if you just leave wildlife with that mixture of habitats and substrate, you then, lo and behold, amazingly, get miles more diversity in the wildlife that comes along. You create variety in the landscape, then you get way more variety in the wildlife population.
So I thought it was really interesting that you're creating gardens that mimic the vegetation and habitats found on brownfield sites. So for anyone who doesn't know, can you explain what a brownfield site is and what's so special about them?
Well, of course, not every brownfield site is perfectly special, but I mean, most brownfield sites are usually ex-industrial sites or sites that we've worked on or used or built on and then have been left, essentially. And all that's doing is it's creating that diversity of structure and topography and soils and substrates that I've just been talking about. So, you know, you're going to have some bits of tarmac, you're going to have some probably gravelly areas, you're going to have some structures, maybe some brick walls, some brick rubble, some concrete. You might have some pools of water that are ephemeral and only maybe puddles and don't last very long. You're going to have pockets of topsoil probably. You're going to have some scrubby vegetation. So you've got that wonderful mosaic of habitats. And we really, you know, our disturbance and our activity, if you manage it correctly, is incredibly good for wildlife. All we've got to do, I think, is to actually design these places. If we're going to create them from new, we design these places that are going to work from an aesthetic to an extent and have some acceptance by the public. You know, if you just abandon a place, it'll become great for wildlife, but it might not be a place that the public necessarily want to walk around. The exciting thing, I think, is to be able to design these things so they look cool and they still do all the same things that a completely abandoned brownfield site would do. That's where I think the potential is, definitely.
So you were working, or you've done a lot of work at the Clapton Park estate. And one of the key things I think you mentioned on your website is the maintenance of these sites, which I guess ties into how the public views them. How important is it to get the maintenance right going forwards? And how different is that to the traditional ways that we manage public areas?
I think the first thing to say about maintenance is it is a totally undervalued thing. No one really pays carers very much, whether it be for carers for green space or carers for people. If you talk to anyone in the health service, they'll tell you that, you know, people that care for people, these are the most important people. And certainly for green space, the same. So that people who maintain, for instance, public housing estates, your designers who have got the trendy job and they're cool, and then you've got the guys that follow on and look after the space afterwards that are paid poorly. They spend their whole life with ear protection on. And the maintenance of these spaces basically just got dumbed down through the 80s and 90s to such an extent that really they were just, I don't know, you wouldn't know what time of year it was. Often when you walk through a lot of public housing, you wouldn't know, you know, it's evergreen shrubs, it's cut grass, it's herbicide edges, all those things that basically make maintenance, dumb it down to such an extent that no one actually is even interested in it. You don't even get complaints about it because it's so dull. It's so dull that no one even notices it. So I think what we need to do first is to put some importance and some emphasis on the people that look after the space. And there needs to be as much emphasis on how a place is maintained than there is on how the original design goes in. The design has to have a connection with what the maintenance is going to be, what budget is going to be, what you want from the space. And if we can somehow, and this is a bugbear of mine amongst many, we often can get quite a lot of funding for infrastructure projects, right? So you can often get money to build stuff. Everyone comes along, it's all exciting, loads of volunteers. And then, of course, everyone disappears, and then the maintenance guy on £9-10 an hour is left to deal with all this stuff. What we should do is we should say, right, here's 10 grand for an infrastructure project. Here's 5 grand to build something interesting, which may well be plenty enough. Here's 5 grand to pay a local gardener to look after it with the community after it's finished. Now, the 5 grand you spend on the local gardener is the best 5 grand you're going to spend. All we've done is maybe we haven't put an extra pergola up, or we haven't put an extra bit of paving down. We need to shift the emphasis from constantly building stuff to actually taking care of stuff. If we could make that shift, that would totally transform a place. Because most people are not going to be worried if the most perfect, trendiest piece of infrastructure goes in, but they are going to be worried if after that's finished, it's basically a tip and no one cares about it and it doesn't function. And therefore, it's in no way a sustainable thing.
Yeah, I mean, that is a massive, massive problem for any design, I think, across the board, whether it's public space or domestic space. So part of that, I think, might have been the driver behind you including edible plants in that scheme. Did that work in terms of getting people invested in the gardens and getting them out there and also taking on some of the maintenance work themselves?
Yeah, I mean, food is certainly in somewhere like London, totally the key. Everyone has a connection to food. And in a lot of cultures, that certainly on the estate we look after, it's absolutely in their guts. It's food growing, it's in their soul. And it's something, especially with first generation on our estate, Turks, Kurds, especially, it is absolutely fundamental to what they are. And they have, in our case, often they've sat in a flat for 20 years, looking down at a piece of grass that some bloke like me has been cutting every 2 weeks. Totally pointless spaces, a lot of them, So all we've done is walked around the estate and thought, well, this doesn't make sense. We're cutting this piece of grass. There's not enough room to play football. There's not enough room to do much else. We could make that into a growing space. And there's thousands of these bits of ground in social housing estates just sitting there. So all we did really was give little bits of space back to people to grow a bit of food in. And these are tiny spaces. We're only talking about 8 foot square. That's all people get. You'd be amazed. It's incredible what they do with that. And then we thought, well, why can't we extend this? This doesn't make sense. So we've got people growing food now for themselves. And yet all our public space, all the public shrub beds and all the other bits and bobs of green space that we look after, that's still all ornamental, essentially. Still all 1970s public housing plants. So then we decided we would pretty much only use food plants in any new planting. So instead of putting pyracantha and mahonia in, we put gooseberry and red currant and mulberry or fig. We put food into public spaces. Still brilliant for wildlife, obviously. Still got a huge ornamental value, and lo and behold, everyone notices those spaces now. So if you walk down a street and see loads of green gages and red currants on the side of your street, you're going to notice that space. Not only are you going to notice it, but you can then take those things and eat them. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's a total win-win. Again, it's getting away from that kind of rigid, I suppose, garden-y thing of, you've got to have ornamental shrubs, you've got to have evergreens, you've got to have... That's what people want. Well, generally, we found in our work, that's not what people want. People would rather have a space that actually functions for them, rather than looks pretty for someone else, I guess.
Does it ever descend into fisticuffs when the red currants are ripe?
Yeah, no. In fact, the weird thing was, of course, that it took us many years to get people to understand that this public space was theirs and they could take it. People were scared to take the food. It was so weird. And that's because there's years of thinking this disconnect between them and the space around them, and they didn't think it was theirs anymore. It took us ages to say, yeah, this is obviously your space. You live here. We don't live here. You live here. All this public space is for you. What's the point of my job as a contractor if it isn't making the spaces around you for you? Who else am I doing it for? Do you know what I mean? That's the other fundamental thing leading on from that about changing contracts for looking after spaces, which is what we've been pushing for many years, and it is starting to happen a little bit, certainly on our estate. You've got to change the way contracts are worded. Worded contracts for looking after public space were often just about the length of grass and how much percentage of weed cover and all these banal kind of boring stuff. We've hopefully changed it now, where the emphasis of the maintenance contract is about how you make the space to suit the people that live there. It's blindingly obvious, if you ask me, but that never came into it most of the time. And the other interesting thing to do is to have your quality control. So the quality control for the way you look after the space should be judged by residents and residents' comments. It shouldn't be going out and measuring things with tape measures. That's my opinion. Now, obviously, there's an element of trust in all this, but I think once you make that leap, then it opens up all sorts of possibilities for people who live there.
Do you ever get any pushback on the aesthetic side of it from maybe some residents, but also from, councils and people like that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to give the impression that everything's wild and completely woolly. I think it's very, very important to have the respect to understand that people don't want a place to look a mess right outside their door. And the worst thing you can do is to turn up on someone else's estate, in effect, and say, I know what's best for you. You need biodiversity. I'm going to leave all these weeds along all winter and it's going to look a mess, but don't worry, it's good for the bugs. That's the worst thing you can do. It's always a case of what's acceptable and what fits. So how long can you leave wildflowers before they start looking too messy and before they trap too much litter? How woolly can you leave some of the shrub planting to allow it to flower and to berry before it starts impacting on the pathways? That's an obvious skill that you build up when you look after a space. But that's vitally important. You don't impose your own, often different views onto people that are living there. And as soon as a place looks a bit messy, or as soon as we get anyone who says, sorry, I'm not happy with all that grass outside my window, it's too long and I don't like it, well, then we'll clear it up. You know what I mean? So it's judging these things. I think that's the other key with people who care for spaces, is that they're there on a regular basis. So you get a feel for what people want. So there's some bits of the estate we can leave a bit wilder, and there's some bits of the estate that we keep a lot tidier. And that's very much dependent on who's living there and what their opinion of things are. Do you know what I mean? So, and you can't do that unless you're there regularly, can you? This is where maintenance staff are so underused, really, and underplayed. And the other thing, of course, you do, and this is, again, something that we're trying to get into contracts, is the most important time you spend as a contractor is the time you spend without ear protection on. So nearly every job in a standard maintenance contract requires ear protection, right? So then you can't hear anyone, you can't talk to anyone. You spend your whole life in some sort of, muddled sort of, the time without ear protection on is the most important time. And that's when you really hear the important stuff.
Couldn't agree more on the maintenance side of things. But what I have found with even experienced gardeners and designers and myself, what I find it really hard to get information on is when to actually cut things back for wildlife purposes. And I have been trying to pin down people and saying, where can I find this out? And I think it is that place where we meet with entomologists and work with them. But do you know how people can kind of find out? Say I've got a wildflower patch or I've got a meadow area. I don't know when to cut it because I don't know when things life cycles have finished. And that information is really hard to find.
Yeah. Well, I think you're talking about, this is domestic gardens where people are specifically going to manage it for wildlife.
Yeah. Well, both, I guess, yeah.
Okay. I guess the best place to talk to if you were interested in vertebrate life and what would be best, for instance, on a wildflower meadow, which is a classic kind of thing, then bug life would be a really good place to join for starters and to talk to. They are the only invertebrate charity and they are really an interesting bunch and they do some really good stuff. So they would be good. Obviously, the local wildlife trust would be good. I think a lot of it, and as we were saying earlier, is to judge what you want. I mean, ideally, the problem with wildflower meadows is not a problem, but one of the issues with wildflower meadows is if you cut it all for hay in the middle of the summer, you're going to destroy the habitat for quite a big proportion of the invertebrates. So not ideal. Best thing usually is to cut part of it at a certain time of year and then cut the other part another time of year, or maybe cut one half 1 year and then cut the other half the next year. In a domestic situation, that works fine because you're not going to have much scrub encroachment and issues like that. In public spaces, when they've done that, sort of half 1 year, half the other, sometimes you get problems with scrub, especially if it's near a woodland, coming in and then cutting it every 2 years. Sometimes you end up with a fairly scrubby area rather than a wildflower rich area. I'd personally say if it was your own garden, it would be good to at least leave a proportion of the meadow uncut 1 year, and then the next year cut that bit and leave another proportion uncut. If you can do that, when you cut the main area, you'll give somewhere for a lot of the invertebrates to go and give them some sort of chance of completing their lifestyle. Because a lot of invertebrates, might spend the winter in dead stems, of course, which obviously you're going to then remove. There's a fair chunk of invertebrates that spend the winter in the ground. And the timing of the cut will obviously, the later you can leave it, will give them more chance to get into the ground. And obviously that will then affect them much less. So just leave a proportion, I guess, if you can. Because if you leave it too long without it being cut, obviously, then it doesn't become a meadow. It will gradually become a scrubland and eventually woodland. So you've got to manage it in some way if you want to keep it as a meadow. The big thing I'd say about meadows is, and this is going back to the Brownfield thing, is the incredible importance, if you can, of dictating what your soil is before you sow your meadow in the first place. If you just sow a wildflower meadow mix onto rich topsoil, unless you're going to spend a lot of time hand weeding, you're going to eventually end up with a much less diverse flower community than you would probably like. If you can in some way take your topsoil somewhere where you need it, maybe on your veg patch or somewhere where it's much more useful, and then either you can sow in the subsoil that's left there, or if you've got some time and energy, then you can bring in some sands or some low fertility substrates. And then once you've reduced the fertility of your soil, then when you sow your wildflower meadow, it's going to work better and last better and generally be less work to keep looking good. So if you can do that, that would make a massive difference. One other quick thing you can do while you're at it, if you're going to bring sands and stuff in, then leave a pile of sand, ideally something like building sand, bricklaying sand, unvegetated if you can. So if you put a little mound of bricklaying sand somewhere in a sunny space and just keep the vegetation away from it so it remains sunny, you will then be full of solitary bees nesting in the ground. And then that's so easy to do, and we've trialled it here a lot, and we're on clay soil, so we had none of these species before. Now we have loads, just simply from a pile of sand. It is as easy as that. In the same way as drilling a post is easy for the hole nesting bees, leaving a pile of bricklaying sand in a sunny place is the best thing for ground nesting bees.
Yeah, I saw that on your website. It's brilliant. Really good idea. It's just about getting lots of different habitats and kind of linking them all together. Yeah.
It is. Yeah, if you can do that, that's all it is. Diversity of substrates and topography gives you more diversity of wildlife, for sure.
Actually, it's a bit of a cliche question, but what are your favourite plants or trees to use that are good for aesthetics and also good for wildlife?
Tree-wise, I think hawthorns are very underestimated. I think people put hawthorns only in a hedge, and if you grow them as a tree, I think they're a beautiful tree. And then you can clip them up so you can see the stem, so you can make them into more of a tree than a shrub. They are obviously packed with wildlife. I mean, they're one of the best trees for wildlife. And the other, shrub-wise, there is it's not the flashiest shrub in the world, but older buckthorn, common buckthorn, really lovely trees, brilliant for bees. Obviously the food plant for a brimstone butterfly. Don't get too big, don't get too huge. You can manage them quite easily. That's a really nice shrub. I'd say the favourite plant probably from a bug and an aesthetic from my point of view is something like fennel, for instance. So fennel's reliable, hardy, always grows well, and then when it flowers is absolutely one of the best things for bugs you can have. And another plant I quite like, which is a little bit underused, which always looks good, is woad. Plant is used for dyeing. Brilliant yellow flowers, and then you get really cool kind of candelabra type black seed heads on it when it's in seed. I suppose a wildflower that I quite like that's really lovely in dry borders is Scadius, but small Scadius. It's a chalk downland plant, and it doesn't dominate the space. It's nice and open. You can grow stuff in and underneath it, and it's a really delicate and interesting looking plant. So small Scadius would be another one I'd use.
So I'm going to just touch on green roofs because I know obviously you do a lot of work with those, and I think people might tend to assume that they are going to be sedum or a wildflower seed mix that you can put on your green roofs, but it sounds as if you're really pushing the envelope with those. So can you just talk a little bit about what you've been doing with your green roofs and how diverse they can be? You know, how much can we actually really play with that idea?
Yeah, well, it's the same ideas as on the ground, but the roofs give you an undisturbed place in a city, don't they? That's one of the advantages you've got. In public spaces, it's really difficult to dump a pile of sand and obviously not be a sand pit rather than a habitat for good enough reasons. But you can put sand mounds on green roofs, for instance. So in the same way as in a domestic garden, you can use a sand mound because you have control over the space. Sand mounds on green roofs are brilliant for ground nesting bees. The other thing that's really cool to do on a roof is to try and create wetlands, and they would be essentially the nature of a roof. They would be temporary wetlands, so they would be shallow areas of water that would fill up in the winter and then dry out in the summer. And that doesn't sound the most exciting thing from a lot of people's point of view. They are incredibly important places for wildlife. So temporary wetlands, really good places. Again, you can't create them on the ground as easily in public space, for sure. On a roof, you can do that. And also on a roof, you can have piles, stacks of logs. You can have lots of topography. Again, so we try and have some topography on the roof. So instead of being all the same thickness of soil, there'll be a few places where it'll be a bit deeper, other places where it'll be a bit thinner. That gives you, a slightly more diverse plant community. I suppose it's just trying to get away from putting topsoil on everything. Don't do that if you can. And also don't rake everything flat. So if you can do those two things, really make a difference. And from an aesthetic, I think, certainly from a landscape on the ground point of view, you can create much more interesting places if you have a variation in topography. And then, of course, on the roofs, because we can dictate the soil completely on a roof, can't we? Because we're bringing the soil up. Then you can vary the soil. So on one roof, we might use about 3 different soil types. And again, that's going to dictate a different plant community in each of those soil types. You might have a pile of brick and concrete rubble, another really good place for insects to warm up on and for spiders to get in and all those other things. And again, it's not a case of blanketing every roof with rubble. It's a case of mixing up the materials. That's the key, I think, to it. And then you can start looking at some really interesting landscapes.
Yeah, just kind of think outside the box a little bit, get away from our tidy-minded, flat, neat gardens and start playing with plants and materials, which is really what gardens are about, I think.
Absolutely. The exciting thing is that you can dictate your landscape with your soils rather than the other way around. So you can design the plantscape, as it were, with the substrates that you use. If you have opportunity to bring in substrates, you know what I mean? Then you can start to say, right, here I'm going to have a low growing area because I'm going to use pure crushed concrete or something in there, or a very low fertility soil. That means all the plants are going to grow low. I know that. Then the next place along might be brick rubble, which has clay in it, which is much more nutrient rich, so therefore they're going to get taller. I'm not saying you have to use construction waste only, but you can dictate with different sands, for instance, and different materials what your plants are going to do. You know what I mean? So rather than, if you just have a blanket 6 inch of topsoil everywhere, then every plant is going to want to revert back to the same thing. If you change the soils, then you're going to be able to say, right, I want you to grow small and I want you to grow taller, and you'll be happy because that's going to be dry, and you'll be happy because that nutrient level is going to be a bit higher. It's kind of another dimension to gardening, really.
So if people wanted to find out more about what you do and your work, where could they go?
Well, there's our website, which is grassroofcompany.co.uk, and I tend to use Twitter quite a bit. So if you want to see more up-to-date stuff that we've been fiddling around with, then @grassroofco is my Twitter.
So a really big thank you to John for the interview, and thanks also to you for listening. And I must say a very big thank you to Jeff Davis, who recommended that I get in touch with John and reminded me that he's out there and that he's doing amazing work. And if you'd like to check out Jeff's garden, which I highly recommend you do if you like wildlife gardens, you can just search for a bee-friendly wildlife garden in Surrey on YouTube, and he does a walk around of his garden, and it's lovely, and I think you'll enjoy it if you like that kind of thing. So thank you, Jeff. And I hope you have a great week, and I will catch you next Tuesday. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website www.rootsandall.co.uk, where you'll also find my blog and a sign-up form for the newsletter, which gives you a weekly roundup of content, plus the inside scoop on things like upcoming guests. Or you can subscribe wherever you normally get your podcasts. Email me with comments and feedback at podcast@rootsandall.co.uk. Follow me on Twitter, Roots and All, Facebook, Roots and All UK, and Instagram, Roots and All Pod. But please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support my work, because if you like what I do, please help me to continue doing it. Even if you make a one-off donation of £1, trust me, it all helps, and I will be immensely grateful. So please go to Patreon and search for Roots and All.